Hi, everybody. My name is Michael McDowell. It's great to be with you. Today, we're going to be looking at how do we make deep learning doable? So if you have been looking at these top 10 practices, these top 10 habits, if you will, of the Rigor Redefined Place Map, and you've done a little bit of habit mapping. So you've taken out like the color codes and said, hey, green, we routinely engage in this, yellow, sometimes red. We're not doing this we're not all on the same page on this. And you really honed in on habits 7 and 8 and said, these are the ones I really want to focus on with my students. I want to get better at doing. This is the video for you. This is all about deep learning. How do we develop conceptual understanding? So how do we help students routinely develop relationships across multiple ideas? And then how do we help them develop, discuss, and even challenge some of those relationships across those ideas? So how do we develop it? How do we apply it? That's really going to be the idea around this session. Deep learning is associated with these three cornerstone impacts around deep learning. So number one is students need to be able to seek help from peers. They need to be able to evaluate and reflect on their learning and on the particular differences between certain concepts, and they need to be able to engage in classroom discussion. This is really a social component of learning. Students need to be able to socially construct ideas in deep learning, and that is what is so essential. So classroom discussion, evaluation, reflection, seeking help from peers are key criteria for students being successful in being able to relate ideas over time. One of the most interesting things that we have found, interesting phenomena we found in terms of the research, is around quality classroom discussion. So interestingly enough, research has found that while teachers might be displaying deep level learning, when students are actually talking to one another, they're not speaking at the same complexity level that the teacher is. So the teacher might be showing deep, but then the students are breaking that down and often speaking at that surface level of learning. So that old mantra of like, who does the talking does the learning needs to be modified a little bit to who does the high quality talking, they do the high quality learning. So in 60% of classrooms, when teachers are teaching at that complex level and students have a turn and talk or think, pair, share, or they're in a Socratic seminar, 0 minutes of those classrooms, of the classroom discussion, is actually showing the deep level of learning. 15% of classrooms, it's 2 minutes or less per day. And in a quarter of classrooms, we see it less than 15 to 30 seconds per day. So if we can actually build students' habit of 2 minutes and 1 second per day of classroom discussion, we will beat the research. And if you want to learn more about that, I have a blog from Edutopia that shows lots of different practices that may be helpful in boosting some of that work. We're going to look at some of them here, but we're not going to be able to look at all of them, but we'll look at a few. One thing to consider as a team is to really think about, where do you think your kids sit on this continuum of discourse? So we call this the discourse continuum. If you look at a 1 being students are silent, or they say, I don't know, when you ask them questions or when they're talking to one another, all the way to students are working together and they are engaged in shared problem solving, where do you think your students sit? So the 1 would be silent, 2 would be they speak in fragments, 3 would be they use full sentences, 4 would be they add academic language when they're speaking, 5 would be they're starting to relate ideas, they're building complex sentences. We then would look at 6, where they're incorporating the ideas of others, so they're paraphrasing, they might be pulling in different viewpoints, different perspectives. 7 would be that they start to apply complex ideas across multiple concepts. So now we're starting to see that they're taking different ideas and putting them together. We get into 8, where they're starting to infuse claims and evidence and reasoning. This is really where we're getting into that habit 8 around applying conceptual understanding. And then 9 and 10 are really at that transfer level. 9 being they can apply complex ideas across contexts, and 10 would be that they can solve complex problems. So you might want to pause it here. And if you're with others, to just say, where do you think your students, like on average, sit? Like, we know you've got students kind of everywhere, but if you were to say, on average, this is where my students sit, this will really help you decide, where do I want to focus my time, energy, and effort in starting to cultivate some of these habits. With the practices that I'm going to show you, it's really, really important that you plan for implementation by making sure that you're linking to habit science. So it's really, really important that you pick something small and manageable for you. Number 2, that it's routine. It's something you can do over and over and over with students. It can't be, We're going to do complex discussions on Thursdays, but then not have them practice Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. That's the equivalent of like having students swim in a swim meet, but they don't practice all week. They're just not going to be able to perform, and you're going to be less likely to use some of those practices because you're just gonna be like, this isn't working. Number three, it's got to link to the practices you're already doing. So you've got to connect this to something you already do. So while you take roll, you might have them do this practice, or you might link this to an exit ticket, or right when you get into guided practice, but it's got to stack to something you already do, or else it'll just feel like another thing. It's really important that you don't add more. Pick one thing, pick one practice, and then just do that for the next couple of weeks. And don't try to add 3 or 4 or 6 of them, but just one, and just test that out for the next few weeks, which brings us to sprinting, which is this idea of, if you're in high school, pick one class period to do this in. If you're in elementary or primary, please just pick one discipline or KLA that you're working on. So if you're thinking, okay, I want to do this with all of my students, maybe a smaller group of students, or maybe just in literacy, or just in social studies, or just in mathematics, but not everybody at front. Let's prototype this, pilot this before you try to scale. And then lastly, make sure that you share this with others. Like, here's what I tried. This is what I learned. This is where my students were at the beginning. This is where they are now. I think it's really important to share successes as well as, we'll just call them failures. Like, this didn't work. Like, we tried it, we gave it a go, it didn't work, or it worked for these students, but not for these students, which is what normally happens with our particular work. So this to me is a nice little checklist of just saying like, okay, when we leave this call or when we're about to go implement something, are we doing these types of things? That to me would be key. One other thing that I would strongly suggest is that you set up a few set plays. So you might think of like lesson study as a way, as something that we normally do, where we might plan out a lesson, we might focus in on one specific instructional routine or move, and then we go in and we actually look at the implementation and get feedback. That's the same thing here. Teaching is so fluid. There's so much going on in a classroom. Really narrowing it down to like, what's that one small thing where we can stop and practice that. So like you think about in soccer, they've got a corner kick where they stop the fluidity of the game, and then there's the set move. What's the teacher action? What's the student action? What's the task that students are working on? This is what Elmore and City call the instructional core. Just what are those three things? And to me, we really want to refine down to a level of precision around those pieces. And then as a team, or by yourself, or with a small group, you start to say, okay, here's what I do, here's what the students do, and here's the task. So let's look at a couple of practices that we could put into that set play. One of my all-time favorites to start with students on building those complex sentence structures are what we call think, pair, share with conjunctions. Now, I'm going to be using these what we call these 4 squares, as just a way to kind of visually show what each step would look like. So step 1, we would place students in pairs and ask them to state a sentence that connects 2 or more ideas. So example, we might say to students, talk to the person next to you about how cubes and squares are both shapes. We then get into step 2, and we provide students with some academic vocabulary. So we might say to students, we want you to say that same sentence again, but we want you to use the word dimensions. And then we'd ask them to restate the sentence that connects 2 or more ideas with that new vocabulary. In step 1, we just want to get students to talk about 2 ideas, because remember, deep learning is about relating ideas, but we want to make sure they're using full sentences. We want to then add the academic vocabulary. We want to lower the threshold so they'll just start. And then we get into step 3 and we say, hey, we actually want you to now add some conjunctions. So we'd like you to use the words because, but, so within your sentence. So you might say something like, cubes are like squares, so if I have 6 squares, I can make a cube. And we might do something like, cubes are like squares, but cubes are 3-dimensional and squares are 2-dimensional. And then we go into that step 4 and we ask students to write that sentence down. And what they're doing is they're building complex sentences by relating ideas. So we talk about it, talk about academic language, add in some conjunctions, because, but, so, and then we actually have students write that complex sentence down. This is a nice practice to just get students to start to use full sentences, use it with academic vocabulary, and start to relate ideas. And so the key, if you decide to use something like this, is how can you make it small and doable? How could you do it every day? And then where would you stack it? So is this something you do right at the beginning of the day, or at the end of the day, or right in the middle? But this could be something that over the course of several weeks, students will start to get more familiar with the use of this. And then you can add other things like subordinating conjunctions, like although cubes are like squares, or a positives, cubes, comma, and then you define a cube. And then you would say, cubes are related to squares. And then you could do that type of work to build more complex sentence structures. So the think, pair, share with conjunctions is a nice way to just boost those practices up a little bit, start verbal, and then move into writing to get them to that place. Another one that's really nice is called Picture Worth 1,000 Words. The idea here is you show a picture to students and you have them create a question or a statement from those particular pictures. You then ask students to check each other's work to ensure that they have the following. It's a sentence and it's not a fragment. They use academic vocabulary. They use correct capitalization and punctuation. Then you would repeat with a new picture, except this time have students create a complex sentence. Ensure students write one of the sentences that they created and have peers review with each other's work. So this could be using a conjunction. And then repeat with a new picture, but provide a fronted adverbial. So this, you might have students finish the sentence. So you might say something like courageously, mysteriously, quick as a flash, and actually have students start to finish that and then have them write a sentence there. So now you can start to infuse some more complex sentence structures with students. This is a nice way to get students to read, write, and talk to one another. So they're giving each other feedback. Remember, peer-to-peer feedback is really important. They're doing evaluation and reflection. They're doing classroom discussion. And they're actually building some complex sentence structures in small, doable ways for teachers and small, doable ways for students. This is getting students and teachers both in action together. Another one is called the Final Word Protocol. This is a nice protocol that really helps boost students' reading and speaking, but also listening. So the way this works is that we assign students a reading task and ask them to identify one quote that stands out to them. Step 2, we would have students get into groups of 4 and ask them to number themselves 1 to 4. We would then have person 1 share their quote without any elaboration to the group. And then in clockwise fashion, everyone else would comment on the quote that was selected by that first person. Person 1 would then conclude the process by sharing their own thoughts on the quote they selected. And the process is then repeated for everyone. Here's some really interesting things about this. When I share my quote but don't elaborate, it actually gives everyone else the opportunity to think about why they think the quote might be important. They're also evaluating why they think the first person might have selected it. And then it allows the first person to actually build and listen to what everyone else said to say, oh, you know what? I didn't think about that, or that's exactly why I picked this. We also find that when students do this, sometimes they find the same quote, and that actually hits on a key theme, something that's really interesting or that really resonated with the students. And that leads to more complicated, sophisticated conversations that can happen after the Final Word Protocol. So these are very low lift protocols that help students with reading and listening to one another and speaking in more complex ways. One other reading protocol that I think is really, really effective is what's called text to text, text to self, and text to world. In this one, what we do is we prompt students to read a text, and then what they do is they discuss how the text connects to other stories, movies, songs, or books that they've read, seen, heard before. We would then have students move to how this text connects to their own lives. How does this resonate to them, to their families? It then moves them to discuss how this connects to the world. How do they see how this connected to the past, to today, to the future? We then have them debrief that as a class. So we'd say, what did we hear from, how did the text to text come about in your groups? What were some of the themes and patterns? How did this connect to us? How did this connect to the world? And it's a nice way to engage in deep level learning, but then also to start to move to a little bit more of that transfer level work if we want to get to those connections to the world. A chalk talk is a really powerful practice that we can use. This is something what we do is we present students a question to reflect upon, and then we give students an additional question that might connect to that they should be prepared to think through with others. We then put students around the room, and we might give them butcher paper, or we might have vertical boards that they might look at. And we tell students that they will now answer questions with 2 other students. So we put them into groups of 3, and we ask them to stand next to that piece of paper, and then they should have different colored markers, and they should begin drawing visuals, drawing connections, lines to each other, comments, ideas, all up on that board, but they should not talk during this time. So they're all together, drawing out, writing, coming up with ideas, but they don't speak. They then rotate to another group's paper and they begin adding additional ideas and questions. Students should not talk during this time as well. And then they move to step 4, which is now they return to their original paper and they discuss any questions, comments, or understanding that emerged during this activity. These ideas are then shared with the entire class. I love the chalk talk because it gets kids moving around. It really helps students who need a little bit more time processing to have that processing time without people immediately starting to speak. We also find that at the end, when they do start to speak, they're speaking at a deeper level. They're talking about synthesis. They're talking about how this compares, how this contrasts, how these things link, how they differ. And to me, I think that's a really powerful way of engaging in deep level learning is the chalk talk. Now, this takes a little bit more time to set up, and you have to have paper or whiteboards, or you have to have a setup in order to do the chalk talk. But if you do have that opportunity to engage in that, it's a very, very powerful practice to use. A feedback strategy that I have found to be really, really powerful is what's called the DOTS protocol. So here's how this works. Step 1, you review a student's assignment using the success criteria. So you're reviewing their work and you put a colored dot on a specific area of strength or concern. You might do it on both. The key is that it's the same color dot. So you put a dot on their work and they have to discern whether this is something that they did well or something that needs to change. So you pass the work back to students and you state to students that the dot refers to that area of strength, area of weakness, and let them have 3 minutes to figure out whether a change needs to be made. You then walk around and monitor whether students use work samples and success criteria or peers to evaluate that. Do they use some of these tools that you've set up for them? If you find that students are not using those, use probing questions to support them in their analysis. Like, maybe you should look at your rubric. Why don't you phone a friend? Why don't you look at these work samples that I have up for you? You then ask students to share their thinking in relationship to the dot. Start with, share with them that there's similarities and differences between their analysis and your own. Like, I like how you shared this, but it's not quite right. Tell me a little bit about what you're thinking, and then share with them, here's what I was looking for there. And you debrief this process. It really helps students with actually doing more analysis of their work. There's more deeper thinking around feedback. It's not just that they receive feedback from you and then they just do it, but they're not thinking about it. This puts a little bit more work on students. Now notice, you're still doing work. You're just not doing all the work. And that's where the DOTS protocol helps students with what I call approximate feedback. It's kind of like that warm, cool game. Like, you're getting warmer, but we need to see if you can get there, as opposed to it's right there, or no, you're wrong. While corrective feedback has its time and place, at the deep level, I think approximate feedback can be super powerful. Another practice that can be helpful, similar to the chalk talk, is what we call the World Cafe. The way that World Cafe works is that you place students in small groups, and you do this near a blank poster on the wall. And then one student is the scribe for the group. The teacher provides a prompt and an example for students to discuss, and then the scribe writes down the responses from other students. Now, I suggest that you do things like, don't just write a list. You might start with a list, but then say, could you come up with an analogy? Could you do a concept map? Could you create a visual? Then, so then in step 2, once they've done this, then what you say is the scribes are going to stay where they are, and then students move to a new poster, or what we would call a cafe. They should not go to the next cafe with the same students. So it's not clockwise, it's just find another cafe. Once they get there, the scribe then shares what the prior group discussed and then hands the pen to a new scribe. The teacher then provides a new prompt, and students are tasked with integrating that new prompt with whatever the other team had written with the first prompt. Step 2 and 3 are repeated at least 2 to 3 more times. The teacher then walks around the class and then places a dot on those cafes. So the students go back to their original group, and then they see a dot on their paper. And then that dot is either you did something really, really well or something you might need to change. And then the students have to decide whether or not they did something right or something that they need to change. And when I do this, I usually have them try to convince another cafe, and then I walk around and monitor, and then I'll ask probing questions to really help them kind of push their thinking along over time. Other practices that can be really powerful are the Socratic seminar. The Socratic seminar is one of the go-to practices that many teachers use in high school history and English classrooms. I'll briefly go through those steps. So step one, after students read a text, we want to establish some agreements of how they're going to talk to one another. We usually have them in a circle, or if you have a really large class, you might have one circle of students and then a fishbowl outside of the students. And then they need to review some sample agreements. For example, talk to each other, not just to the discussion leader. Step two, we move to you have an inner circle that will discuss, while that outer circle observes the dialogue. The group should be reminded that this is a discussion of the text and it's not a debate. This isn't to debate one another. And then the groups they rotate after 12 to 15 minutes. So you're going to have this A group and this B group. The inner circle begins with a key question, and the teacher should place probing questions on the board for students to reference as they engage in the conversation. This is kind of priming the pump for them. And then the outer group monitors the use of those probing questions. At the conclusion of both of these groups going, students should reflect on their learning and their engagement in the seminar. Again, really powerful way of doing it. A couple of other ones that I think are really powerful. One is called the what, so what, now what protocol. And this is where we might look at a piece of student work and we might look at giving an effective feedback. So the way that this works, so step one is what we call what. So we provide students with a piece of work and success criteria. We would ask students to write down only factual information on which success criteria have been met or missing in the work sample. So no stories, no inferences. So an example is, there are 3 run-on sentences, or 4 of 6 problems are missing a rationale for the answer. Step 2 is the so what. This is around inferences. This is the story we're telling ourselves. So we prompt students to write or publicly share a summary statement of what patterns or stories emerge from the writing sample. This should be a story about the implications. So this piece has a number of run-on sentences, which will prevent the audience from understanding the ideas of the paper, something like that. And then we get to the now what. This is about action. So we prompt students to generate 3 next steps they would recommend to improve the work samples. And then they should share the next steps with a peer and then with the class. Then step 4 is do the same thing with a peer. So we just did it all as a class. We did it with a work sample. Now we're going to actually have students do that with each other's work. So one student will review the other student's work, and they'll go through the what, the so what, and the now what. Then the other person will repeat. This is a nice way to actually help students with developing clarity of what's expected. It's also really, really powerful in terms of giving and receiving effective feedback. This is also something that you could do with reading a narrative, but it really gets students into understanding, like, what are the facts, what are the inferences we generate, and then what are the actions that we can take from that. And that's really moving us from that developing conceptual understanding to applying that conceptual understanding. There are lots of other practices that we can take a look at. And another one that we might look at is what we call the town hall meeting. The town hall meeting is a really, really powerful practice because this is really moving students to being able to apply that conceptual understanding. So a town hall meeting, just to give you a couple of ideas around that. So step 1, we assign students roles for discussing and debating another group's solution to a problem. So we would have council members, those are for the proposal. We have town employees, and we have those against the proposal. So we've got council members, those for the proposal. We have town employees, and then those against the proposal. And students should remain in character throughout the town hall meeting. Step 2, the teacher shares that one group will present their ideas, followed by questions only from the town council. This is then repeated for the other group. The town council usually discusses this for a certain amount of time. We put 2 minutes on this one. Step 3, the teacher allows public comment. So the rest of the class now gets to ask public comment for and against. After all questions, town employees provide additional information to the council members, and then the council members vote on the matter. And step 4, they debrief this process. It's a great way to get students to engage in some debate, to actually show them how democracy works. And I just love the town hall meeting. So those are a few practices to take a look at in terms of deep learning. Here's just a couple of things that you could consider along the way to get ready to implement some of this work. Number 1, make sure that you've all gone through and connected this practice to some type of habit and some type of evidence that you might be able to collect. So if you're working with others, it's like, hey, we're working on habits 7 and 8. This is a habit that we want to really be focusing on. Here's the practice, and this is what we're going to look for. I would outline them into the 4 steps. This is step 1, 2, 3, 4, and then discuss where you're going to place this particular practice. Before you go into class, I would demo it. So model each step with a colleague. Let's go through it together as a team. There may be a video that you have or a case study. I would go through that. Discuss nuances to current practice. You're doing some of these things already. Students are doing some of these things already. So what are the small little shifts? And then make sure you're highlighting the critical points in the routine. So I try to emphasize those when I was showing some of those practices. That to me is key. Then embed in lessons and practice. So pick a date, pick a time in class to implement. Select the look-fors for that implementation and have someone come in to look and debrief with you as an observer. Then implement and inspect over and over and over. I'm going to do it again, debrief, repeat. Implement, debrief, repeat. To me, these are some nice ways to really make sure that you embed these types of practices and get better at them with students. It's not just about watching you, it's about how are students reacting and changing. So I hopefully those give you a couple of ideas of how to make deep learning a little bit more doable. And yeah, thanks everybody. It's good to see you. Take care. Or good to be with you. I didn't see you, but I'd love to see you. All right, thanks everybody.